Los Angeles, William Bonin has been convicted of 10 murders.
He was convicted for the homosexual torture murders of 10 young men and boys.
Today, the so-called Freeway killer was sentenced to death in the gas chamber.
He murdered at least 21 boys, maybe more. They called him the Freeway Killer. On the morning of February 22, 1996, William George Bonin woke up inside San Quentin State Prison. It would be the last time he ever saw the sun rise. So, what went through the mind of one of California's most brutal serial killers as he faced his final 24 hours alive? Did he feel fear, remorse, or nothing at all? There was one final request, one final conversation, and a chilling last statement. This is the final day of William Freeway Killer Bonin, and it begins at 6 o'clock in the morning. Before he became known as the Freeway Killer, William George Bonin was just a boy growing up in a troubled home in Connecticut. Born on January 8, 1947, his early life was marked by hardship. His father struggled with alcohol. His mother wasn't present much, and the house was not a safe place for any child to grow up in. When he was still very young, Bonin and his brothers were placed in a state-run juvenile facility. It was supposed to be a protective move, but what he experienced there would leave deep and lasting damage. Years later, Bonin would describe it as a place where he learned how to shut down emotionally, where violence became normal, and where empathy slowly disappeared. After leaving the institution, he tried to follow a more ordinary path. He joined the U.S. Air Force at the age of 17 and served in the Vietnam War. He was honorably discharged, but time didn't heal what had been broken, whatever kindness he showed in public. Behind closed doors, something darker had taken root. The damage from his childhood never truly left him. Instead, it evolved. He built a quiet life, worn the mask of a calm, ordinary man. But beginning in the late 1960s, that mask would start to slip. Between 1968 to 1980, Southern California was gripped by fear. One by one, boys and young men, some as young as 12, began disappearing. Their last known moments were often unremarkable, walking home from school, waiting at a bus stop, or hitchhiking just a few miles. But then they vanished. Many of their bodies were later discovered near highways or remote roadways. The pattern was chilling, and while the crimes varied slightly in detail, investigators began to realize they were looking at a series of attacks carried out by the same person. The press gave him a name, the Freeway Killer. What authorities did not know was that the man behind it all was someone most people would never suspect. William Bonin was a former truck driver with a calm voice and quiet demeanor. He lived in a modest home in Downey and often offered rides to strangers. Some believed he was simply being kind. Bonin rarely acted alone. He involved others, some willingly, some through manipulation. Over time, he recruited several accomplices to assist him, each playing different roles. But Bonin was always the one in control. The break in the case came in June of 1980, when police placed Bonin under surveillance. They had begun to suspect him after linking his van to a recent disappearance. Officers watched as Bonin picked up a teenager and drove to a secluded area. Fortunately, this time, they intervened in time to prevent another tragedy. The arrest led to an overwhelming amount of evidence. In his van, police found restraints, personal items from victims, and tools believed to have been used in the crimes. Even more damning was Bonin's own behavior after being taken into custody. He began talking, calmly, matter-of-factly. Over the course of several interviews, he admitted to over 20 murders. He even detailed the roles his accomplices played. His lack of remorse was deeply unsettling. To some investigators, it felt as though he saw the murders not as crimes, but as a routine. Bonin's first trial began in Los Angeles County in 1981. He was charged with 10 counts of murder, along with several other serious offenses. The trial lasted 6 months. Witnesses testified, forensic evidence was presented, and Bonin's own statements were played in court. The jury deliberated for just 3 days before finding him guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to death. A second trial followed in Orange County, where he was found guilty of 4 additional murders and given a second death sentence. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Bonin appealed his convictions over the next 16 years. He argued issues of fairness in his trial and raised questions about mental health. But court after court upheld the verdict. He remained on death row at San Quentin State Prison. By the mid-1990s, the case was no longer making daily headlines, but for the families of the victims and the state of California, justice had not yet been fully carried out. That moment would arrive on a summer night in 1996. By the time his execution date was set, he had been in prison for nearly 16 years. 16 years of appeals, 16 years of silence, 16 years to think. Now his final hours had begun. At 6 o'clock in the morning, William Bonin woke quietly in his small death row cell at San Quentin State Prison. The room was cold and bare, just a metal bed, a desk cluttered with papers, and a small window that let in the weak light of dawn. The morning routine on death row is rigid. Guards make rounds, meals are delivered, and prisoners spend their final hours waiting. Bonin, like many before him, spent the first hours quietly alone. There was no public access, no visitors, just the unrelenting hum of fluorescent lights and the cold concrete walls. In his 16 years on death row, Bonin had learned how to fill the silence. He had taken up painting and writing, creating a series of short stories titled Doing Time, stories from the mind of a death row prisoner. It was a glimpse into a mind shaped by years of confinement, regret left unsaid, and emotions carefully hidden. Bonin had also forged friendships with other notorious inmates, including convicted murderers Lawrence Bittaker, Randy Kraft. They were like Bonin. These relationships provided a dark companionship in the isolation of prison life. Bonin's lawyers worked frantically behind the scenes, filing last-minute appeals. Meanwhile, Bonin was granted his final phone call, a last chance to speak with someone on the outside, but instead of calling family or friends, Bonin did something unexpected. He dialed a local radio station, seeking to leave a final message in his own words. He said he had made peace with his impending death, but also expressed regret that he had never pursued his teenage passion for bowling enough to turn professional. He disagreed with the state's decision to execute him, calling the death penalty wrong. Despite everything, he denied responsibility for his actions, saying he had no control over them. He said he would never be able to live a normal life outside prison. The morning passed in tense silence. For Bonin, there was no turning back. For the world outside, a dark chapter was about to close. At 12 o'clock noon, William Bonin was joined in his cell by the first of 5 people he had chosen to spend his final hours with. The prison chaplain arrived quietly, offering a calm presence amid the growing tension. The two spoke softly. Bonin listened as the chaplain read passages of scripture and spoke about forgiveness and peace. Though Bonin was raised Catholic and baptized as a child, he remained conflicted about faith. At one point, he shared a letter he had written to Vonda Pelto, a clinical psychologist. In it, he warned others who might struggle with dark urges to go to a quiet place and think about it seriously. He insisted the drive to kill had been beyond his control, and he hoped that maybe God will understand me. The chaplain stayed for nearly an hour, encouraging reflection, but never pushing. The conversation was quiet but heavy, filled with unspoken regrets and lingering questions. At 1 o'clock, Bonin's attorney arrived. The two sat across from each other in the sparse cell, speaking in low tones. The attorney observed Bonin carefully and later reported that he detected no remorse in his client. They discussed the legal battles that had stretched on for years, the appeals filed and denied, and the finality of the coming night. The attorney reminded Bonin of the support he had from the defense team, though he knew the chances for reprieve were gone. Bonin remained distant, his face unreadable. The conversation was mostly practical, focused on what little remained to be done. Around 2 o'clock, a prospective biographer arrived. He had spent months corresponding with Bonin, hoping to capture the full story behind the headlines. Their talk was more personal. Bonin shared memories from his childhood, his time in the Air Force, and the years on death row. Despite the heavy topic, Bonin occasionally showed a hint of humor, recalling his teenage passion for bowling, which he said he regretted not pursuing professionally. As the late afternoon shadows began to stretch across the cold concrete walls of San Quentin, time began moving differently for William Bonin. There were no visitors from family, no final goodbye from anyone who had known him before his life spiraled. By this point, Bonin was entirely cut off from the outside world, except for the few people he had chosen to accompany him during these final hours. At exactly 6 o'clock in the evening, the process of death began, not by chemicals, but by protocol. Bonin was led from his small cell, measuring just 4 feet by 9 feet, into one, even smaller. A death watch cell, 13 steps from the gas chamber. From that moment forward, he was never left alone. 3 guards were posted to monitor him around the clock, making sure he didn't take his own life before the state could. This was now an administrative process. There would be no unexpected turns, no delays. And with the clock ticking, Bonin requested his last meal. According to prison records, it was indulgent, almost childlike in its simplicity. 2 large pepperoni and sausage pizzas, 3 pints of coffee ice cream, and a 6-pack of Coca-Cola. There was no alcohol allowed. Bonin sat with his food and turned on the television. While waiting to die, he watched an episode of Jeopardy! Just outside the execution chamber, preparations were being finalized. A witness list had been confirmed. Reporters, family members of victims, and state officials had been notified. By 10 o'clock, the guards outside the death watch cell stood alert. He had less than 3 hours to live. His final evening was quiet. There were no family visits, no calls from loved ones, just the stillness of a man awaiting death. After 10:30 o'clock, the atmosphere inside San Quentin turned surreal. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead, the echo of boots on polished concrete, every sound felt louder than it should have, as if the building itself knew what was coming. William Bonin had stopped speaking. At that point, Bonin was just 49 years old. His final appeal had been denied. Only 1 hour before his scheduled execution, the United States Supreme Court refused to hear his plea. They ruled that Bonin's lawyers had acted too late in submitting newly discovered evidence, claims that they argued might cast doubt on his guilt. The justices disagreed. They stated plainly that Bonin's legal team had not been inadequate. They had simply delayed too long.
William Bonin will never kill again. Clemency is denied.
It was now just after 11 o'clock. Outside the prison, the mood was tense. Protesters gathered behind metal barricades, some holding candles, others signs. A few prayed quietly, others shouted in anger. Some were there to demand the end of capital punishment, but others had come for the opposite reason, to witness the end of a man they believed had earned this fate many times over. Inside, a prison chaplain stepped in one last time. Bonin looked at him blankly, no tears, no trembling, no final confession. When asked if he wanted to pray, he declined. The man who had once preyed on strangers now seemed eerily at peace. The priest would later describe it not as calm, but as vacant, as if Bonin had already left the room long before his body would. At 11:30, the warden entered the cell. Bonin stood up slowly as he was asked to give his last statement. He did not apologize. He did not name his victims. His voice was steady, without bitterness or warmth, just cold philosophy, spoken like someone trying to explain a point, not face the end of his life. That I feel the death penalty is not an answer to the problems at hand. That I feel it sends the wrong message to the youth of the country. Young people act as they see other people acting instead of as people tell them to act. And I would suggest that when a person has a thought of doing anything serious against the law, that before they did, that they should go to a quiet place and think about it seriously. When he finished, there was silence. At 11:45, guards handed him a clean blue shirt and a pair of jeans. He changed clothes without resistance, folding the old ones neatly. There were no restraints, no struggle. Just the quiet march of inevitability. At 11:50, he was led into the execution chamber, a sterile white room with glass panels, a metal gurney, and a wide viewing window. Waiting behind that window were 12 official witnesses, including reporters, law enforcement officers, and most notably several of the victims' family members. Among them was a mother who had lost her son to Bonin's violence nearly 2 decades earlier. She clutched a photo of her child, eyes locked on the man who had taken him. Bonin lay down on the gurney. He did not fight. He looked up at the ceiling. Medical staff secured the IV lines in both arms. He flinched slightly as the needles went in, but said nothing. His chest rose and fell slowly. From behind the glass, one observer described his face as stone. At the stroke of midnight, the signal was given. A curtain was pulled back. A physician stood by to monitor his condition. As the first drug entered his system, a fast-acting sedative, Bonin's eyes began to close. His breathing slowed. A minute later, his jaw went slack. His limbs stopped moving. From the gallery, the only sound was the quiet sob of one grieving father, watching with trembling hands. At 12:13 in the midnight on February 23rd, 1996, William George Bonin was pronounced dead. Outside, the news spread quickly. Reporters gathered in the cold night air began reading statements live on radio and television. One said, "The Freeway killer is gone. For the families, the chapter is closed, but the wounds may never fully heal." A few protesters outside wept. Others cheered. One woman whispered, "God have mercy on his soul." Inside the prison, the execution chamber was already being cleaned. None of Bonin's family members came to witness his execution. In fact, none would claim his body. The state cremated his remains in a private ceremony. His ashes were later scattered over the Pacific Ocean. But even in death, the story was not over. 3 weeks later, a funeral director notified the Social Security Administration of Bonin's death. That triggered a bureaucratic check, and what they found was shocking. Bonin's mother had been illegally collecting his disability payments for over a decade. Bonin had started receiving those checks in 1972 due to a diagnosed mental disability. But when he was imprisoned in 1982, the payments should have stopped. They didn't. The error totaled $79,000. His mother, when confronted, claimed she didn't know the payments were illegal. She agreed to pay restitution. But for many, it added another disturbing footnote to an already haunting case. Throughout Bonin's 17-year incarceration, experts debated the roots of his crimes. Some blamed his deeply traumatic childhood. He was brutally abused, neglected, and violated from an early age. One of his own lawyers said, "It was virtually impossible for William to be a successful human being. A biographer later noted that Bonin could not handle even the smallest problems in daily life without unraveling emotionally. Yet others, especially the families of victims, rejected any justification. They believed pain, no matter how deep, did not excuse torture, murder, and the irreversible grief Bonin inflicted on 21 young lives. One of the most poignant voices came from David McVicker, who sat among the witnesses that night. David had never fully recovered. He dropped out of high school, turned to drugs, was haunted by nightmares. And yet, watching Bonin die, he later said, gave him a sense of closure, not peace, not healing, but a door finally shut. For William Bonin, it was the end of a long, brutal, and deeply unsettling story. But for his victims, their families, and the survivors, it would never truly be over. What remains now are the scars. Do you think someone like Bonin deserved the death penalty, or was a lifetime behind bars the more fitting punishment? Let us know what you think in the comments. If you want to see more detailed true crime documentaries like this one, check out our other videos as well. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.